Economic warfare, political spin, clandestine operation, Unredacted with Rachel Marsden, lifting the black ink to reveal overt information and intelligence around global events. And now here is your host, Rachel Marsden.
Hey everybody, how you doing? It's Rachel Marsden. You're listening to Unredacted. Thank you so much for tuning in. And today's show is going to be a great one. We have our guest who's already, I can see, on the line, and he will be coming up very shortly. Just a quick recap as to what's going on right now. Two really big items I think you guys need to know about. The first is that Christine Lagarde, who's the former French finance minister, who is right now the president of the Central European Bank, she is triggering the alarm over what she calls the menace that represent cryptocurrencies in the context of the conflict in Ukraine and Russian sanctions that have been imposed by the West against Russia over that incident, over that conflict between the West, aka NATO, and Russia in Ukraine. She is flat out saying that cryptocurrencies are bothering her, specifically within the Russian context. She's saying that a forum on innovation, she's saying this at a forum on innovation for international regulation. And that's troubling because some of you are wondering if there's any way to escape this fiscal straitjacket that the world is slowly plunging into, particularly with respect to the digital identity that has already been created in relation to the sanitary context, the pandemic that we're all still somewhat in, although to a lesser extent than in the last 2 years. So we've seen the emergence of a vaccine pass that consists innately of a digital identity, QR codes that go along with that in many respects. We're seeing the World Health Organization harmonizing a system, and they're doing that right now. They're flat out saying, you can go to their website and check it out. They're harmonizing a system that allows for mutual recognition of all of the digital identities under the guise of vaccine passports. And we now have the European Commission having introduced state-backed digital currency that can be put in a digital wallet and attached to your digital identity. And now we have Christine Lagarde saying that cryptocurrencies, I would assume not regulated by the state, are of concern to Europe and to the European Central Bank because they can serve to I guess, circumvent the sanctions that were placed on. Well, I don't think I think that's the least of her concerns with respect to Russia circumventing Western sanctions. It seems like they're already setting up a system along with China that basically is going to result in them having their own SWIFT type system. and the ability to access international markets within that particular partnership between those two countries. So it seems like a pretext, if anything else, to regulate cryptocurrencies for the average person who isn't necessarily Russian. And when we saw what happened in Canada with respect to protesters during the Freedom Convoy, the truckers who were against vaccine mandates, all kinds of mandates related to the pandemic, and were actively seeking for governments to end those mandates. And we saw what happened when Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, evoked the Emergency Act and allowed for access to information on the people who had donated to that particular cause, and the ability of financial institutions within Canada to block their bank accounts as a result of donations that they had made to that movement, which was a troubling development. And even though the Emergency Act didn't last very long, it wasn't invoked for very long, it was a really scary precedent that obviously marries the ability of the state to control your bank account based on your political ideology and your political actions. And now coupled with the government refusing to allow, or now suggesting that there shouldn't be any kind of non-state-backed cryptocurrency, as Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank has just pointed out, their ability to control and monitor everything in sort of a global panopticon through this harmonized vaccine passport attached to your digital identity. I don't think any of it adds up to anything good unless you're really into dystopian fiction. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up for you guys. It's the big item today that really struck me. And without further ado, I'm going to get into a topic with my next guest that is very relevant. I'm just going to quickly give you a little bit of information, a little bit of a preamble. I don't know if you guys are aware, some of you might be a bit too young to remember, but it is 2 days ago. We are now March 22nd, but on March 20th, it was the 19th anniversary of the US going into Iraq, which ultimately resulted in the removal of Saddam Hussein and a destabilization of that country, and arguably beyond that country to the greater Middle Eastern region for years. And there's still a lot of activity, conflict happening in that area today, even though technically there is no U.S. involvement in any kind of war anymore. I mean, technically the war military mission ended in 2011, if I recall, but there's still reverberations and consequences of that we're seeing today. Iran fired a missile at into the Kurdish region of Iran, ostensibly, according to the Iran Revolutionary Guard, to target Israelis or Israel military that had attacked Iranian military in Syria. So it's a bit of a mess. But all that to say that it was 19 years ago today that kind of all this started. So looking back on all of it, what should we remember from that onset, from that moment when we decided, within the context of 9/11 and the war on terrorism? And I know it's easy for a lot of you who weren't around back then or were too young to remember. You have to understand that the US government and their allies had a lot of leeway with respect to public opinion in the wake of 9/11. So to say today that, oh, well, it was stupid because Saddam Hussein never had any weapons of mass destruction, you have to understand that even though we know what we know now, back then, the US government was given so much leeway because of the horror of direct attacks on US soil on 9/11. So everybody was willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, even some of the real doubters. So it's too easy to just say in retrospect, oh, we should have known that was a stupid move. It's a little more complex than that. So I'm going to bring on my next guest. to talk about all of this. And just before I do, I want to apologize. Some of you noticed in the last show that there were some technical issues with respect to our connection. This is a brand new show. This is the 4th or 5th episode. We're getting all those ironed out. It should be better today, fingers crossed, but it will be ironed out by Monday at the latest. So please bear with us. Thank you so much for your patience in advance. And now I'm going to introduce my next guest, Eric Burkhart, author, former CIA operations officer, who was there on the ground in Iraq and has a heck of a story to tell. And a big part of it was told in his book, Mukhabarat Baby, which you can purchase online still. And I don't know if it's still available in bookstores, but Eric, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
So nice to see you again, Rachel. I'm very excited to be here today.
It's great to have you. So take us back to 19 years ago, almost to the day, when the US went into Iraq and you were in the CIA and you ultimately ended up there. What was going on in your world at the time?
Well, I was a lot younger, and
We all were.
I was single, so the agency loved single operations officers because they could just put them anywhere. They didn't have to worry about knocking on a door and seeing a mother and children to deliver bad news because it's just one single person. So I had the good fortune, at what I thought at the time was to be able to go right into the war zone, and I was one of the first agency officers in Baghdad. It was a fascinating experience. That's the best I can say without getting into too much unnecessary detail. One thing I'd like to say, I agree and really appreciate your comments about the war. Something I tried to point out in my book, it didn't take very long for myself and the groups that were there looking for weapons of mass destruction to come upon these vast chemical gas, mustard gas caches all over Iraq. And these are the weapons that Saddam Hussein used on the Shia population, his own population, and they were still there everywhere. And I had thought at the time, wouldn't this be considered a weapon of mass destruction? But I guess not, because all it does is really, melt people's central nervous system. It doesn't take down buildings. But be that as it may, it was a very, very exciting time. And it's interesting to see the Kurds back in the news.
Yeah, they pop up every so often. So, what you were saying, if I understand you correctly, is that contrary to what we have read in the press and what seems to now be conventional wisdom, as far as you're concerned, you did find weapons that you would qualify as weapons of mass destruction or chemical weapons in Iraq when you were personally on the ground there?
I don't know if I am qualified to say that that was a weapon of mass destruction. I just know that I expected it to be part of the discussion, and it wasn't. And I wrote about it in my book because they were so prevalent. We also found a lot of trucks that had some very suspicious equipment on them, but nothing else. Uh, and I think really at the heart of the matter, what the argument that Colin Powell made and that the administration was making ended up being false, because they were expecting us to find biological weapons factories, mobile biological weapons factories. We were looking for 18-wheelers that you look in the back and, there's Frankenstein's laboratory, and we didn't find it. And certainly there was no nuclear program that was really very active in Iraq. It was a surprise to us as well. So, my observations are more just to share with people, to know that we did find the weapons that Saddam did use on his, on the Shia population after the first Gulf War. But this issue of the 12 Fatah missiles being slung into Erbil, this is very, very interesting. And the target to me is what's most interesting, and what they hit and what they wiped out. Um, the chairman of the car company, Sheikh Baz Barzini, he lost his house, and at first glance, you have to think this must have been an accident. They mistook his house for a Mossad base. They certainly didn't get terribly close to the U.S. consulate that's being built there. Um, Something to share with you that I'm going to go out on a limb and share this with you. That building that's being built, people are assuming it's a consulate building, but I think you understand that the State Department and the intelligence agencies have a very special relationship. And the CIA and the Kurdish Autonomous Region and the Kurdish political entities, the PDK, the PUK, they have a very close relationship continuing with the CIA. So I think the Iranians were trying to say, we know what you're building in Kurdistan, and anytime we can hit that building. I'm sorry.
That's kind of interesting, because according to the Iran Revolutionary Guard, they're saying that they targeted an Israeli strategic center. And now you're saying that it has more to do with the US than with Israel. Is that it?
Well, certainly the missiles being targeted at Erbil, there's a message there for the United States as well. We're still able to impact you, and we know you're still active in Iraq. That's how I feel. I certainly don't feel that I've never seen an Israeli forward base in Kurdistan. I've never seen a Mossad officer in Kurdistan. I'm sure they're there. They don't want to be seen. But uh, what they destroyed was the beautiful mansion of Sheikh Barzini, and he's a very active man in Kurdistan, very wealthy, probably a billionaire, and he has been involved in many projects bringing Turks together and Israelis, and he's had a very, very successful business life. Aside from that, he has been very active in Kurdish political issues with both political parties. That the CIA and the United States government, their regular involvement in all things Kurdish has really been a pain in the rear for the Iranians. Uh, I was a little surprised that they shot those missiles into Erbil instead of Kirkuk or Sulaymaniyah, which is even closer to the Iranian border, just a few mountains in between. And it just made me think, okay, they're building that new consulate, and this house that they destroyed isn't that far. Um, I do think there was a message for more than just Israel, if there was something for Israel there. I think it was a definite message to remind the Americans, to remind us that we know you're still active here, and we are.
Yeah, and especially since, as you bring up, there's a new US consulate being built there. Why now and why there?
I have to say, in that particular region, any State Department structure going up is very likely to have some connection to intelligence organizations.
Mm,
Um, I don't know why it's popping up in Erbil, Rachel, instead of Sulaymaniyah. Now,
mhm,
I've spent a lot of time in Kurdistan. I was representing the agency to President Jalal Talabani for some time, for a year actually. I was at the wedding of one of his sons, knew him very well. And it was always amazing to me to see this bond between the CIA and the Kurdish political parties, and also the Peshmerga and our special ops, always working together. Pretty incredible. Jalal Talabani is dead now. The political situation there is a little bit in flux, but it's looking like it's turning into a healthy democratic situation. But again, the Iranians had a reason for shooting those missiles, all 12, in the area of Erbil and not towards Suleimania, which was much closer, or Kirkuk. And I think it has to do with the building of the consulate. That's my guess.
Now, what do you think U.S. strategic interest is today vis-a-vis Iran and in that region? I think there are people who are asking why, after all these years, after the official end of military action by the U.S. in Iraq, is there still a U.S. presence lingering and now building a consulate? What's the goal? What's the objective at this point?
Well, on its face, building the consulate's going to be, we're spreading our message from the U.S. State Department about how we want to shake hands and be friends with everybody and spread democracy.
Of course.
But there's an issue. We always have difficult transitions when administrations change. There are some things which are very hard to transition over into something else. And when a Republican is in office, we are much more likely to be aggressive in those areas in seeking intelligence. And then when you have a Democrat in office, they do what they can to try and break down what was constructed by the previous administration. And each administration is going to try and find ways to create presence in different parts of the world that the next administration can't take apart. And so it's a really very complicated situation. I think the Biden administration is going to say, we're just building a consulate. But I see that consulate as something more than just a diplomatic outreach. And I think the Iranians also are not happy about it. And that's why they targeted Erbil. There may have been a message, Rachel, for Sheikh Baz. I don't know. He's a very international man. He has contacts all over, including quite a few in Israel. So I cannot imagine he would let the Israelis set up a Mossad base in his home where his children live.
Yeah. The construction of this consulate begin under Trump or under Biden?
The decision to build it was under Trump. I don't know when they laid the groundwork for it. I believe that consulate has been planned for some time.
Are you surprised that despite the fact that Europe has taken a very economic-based approach towards Iran and has backed away from military kind of belligerence and hostilities vis-a-vis Iran, are you surprised that Trump, being the businessman that he was, also did not adopt that approach? They took a very hardline military approach instead of something that we thought that he would be more adept at doing, which was seeing things through an economic lens with respect to Iran, like Europe.
Well, there are some instances in which Trump has got to feed his audience, feed his base. And when the Iranian government is going to continue, regardless of what administration is in DC, is going to continue to threaten with international verbiage to the newspapers and the press and the media, international press and media, death to America, in death to the USA, that resonates with Trump's base. And that's not something I think he can ignore and create some economic outreach towards the Iranians. He's got to look like the muscle man in that instance. And I think that's why he did not pursue anything economic with the Iranians. And we also have to imagine that there may have been some some overtures behind the scenes that the Iranians closed the door on. They may have said, "We don't want to deal with you." Uh, and now I don't have a whole lot of confidence in this administration's foreign policy. I don't really know what it is in a lot of instances, but uh, the Iranians are wanting to remind everybody that they can still be relevant and can still impact what the United States does, especially close to their border. And that's what my thought is. I don't think we have to worry about another war starting with the Iranians anytime soon. At least I hope not.
Yeah, and Joe Biden, I think it's important for people to remember that he was vice president during the Obama administration when Barack Obama kind of led the Western world towards this JCPOA joint cooperation on with this so-called nuclear deal with Iran, which Trump essentially pulverized. And now there's an effort to return Iran to the table after the US withdrew from that agreement. There's now an effort to kind of remake things in a way that's kind of amenable to everybody at this point. But then we have the Russian question now, which plays heavily on world affairs, including on
My
that
goodness.
deal, and Russia and Iran being very close allies, particularly in the eyes of the US and the State Department. So, I mean, do you think there's some wheeling dealing going on behind the scenes here, offering a carrot to Iran if they're to turn their backs on the Russians and to in the context, I guess, of that particular deal?
It's possible, especially from the EU, the European countries. I don't necessarily see it from the United States because I just don't think the Iranians are ready to work closely with the United States unless it is to rebirth this treaty that is being, basically sponsored now by European countries.
Yeah.
Uh, the real problem with that treaty is not all of the efforts it entails to have the Iranians slow down their research. It's the issue of verification. Uh, the previous treaty did not have any real legitimate verification options inside of it. There was no way to tell exactly what the Iranians were doing. And we find out later, at least intelligence tells us, that when the treaty was in fact enacted, the Iranians kept on enriching their uranium and they just moved it. And that's the real key, is verification. I would like to see a treaty involving everyone that's trying to get nuclear weapons, but there needs to be real verification. And it doesn't have to be Americans that verify, it can be Europeans, but it's got to be legitimate.
And then there are some that might say that nuclear weapons are the only way that a country nowadays can guarantee itself against regime change. That if you
That's
don't have,
true.
well, look at Ukraine. If you don't have nukes, then you're susceptible to being attacked by a greater power with them and not having a lot of options after the fact. So, I mean, there's also the argument looking at the problem through the lens of Iranian interests, with them saying, look, I mean, it's really our own protection. With all the regime change activity happening around us, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, some would argue, um, what else do we have to guarantee that it's not going to happen to us? So for them to give that up, and it might not be a given, even with a deal. I
It,
don't know.
it's it's difficult when you're dealing with the Iranians because there's so much propaganda that comes out of Hum and the mullahs there. Uh, I don't recall the last time that a European or an American strike hit inside of Iran. I know that we accidentally shot down a a jet full of innocent people over the Persian Gulf, but I don't know that any European or Israeli or American missiles have flown inside of Iran, unless I'm just missing it and not remembering.
No, it's really proxy wars, like
Yes,
in Yemen, for example, or
absolutely.
with respect to the murder of Soleimani when he was in Iraq. General Soleimani, who was a
Mhm.
high-ranking general of the
He
Revolutionary
was in
Guard of
Syria, I think, at
Jabhat
the time.
al-Nusra or something. Yes, correct. Was he in Syria or in Iraq en route to Syria? It was around the Syrian conflict. I
Yes.
think it might have been the Baghdad airport. Am I wrong about that?
I'm sure you're right. I can't really
Sure.
remember. Uh, I, and, the Iranians, you've gotta give them credit for having, as we would say next to, the border where I'm from, cajones, to actually, you know, take their military and use it to send a message, in a neighboring country. Uh, the Iranians are so intrinsically involved in everything happening in Iraq. And that really is their main focus right now, security-wise, alongside the continuing debate about the nuclear research. Uh, but I was curious. You remember hearing the rumors that the Russians were looking for pilots, and they went to Syria and tried to recruit some pilots, and not just in Syria, but I think maybe in some North African countries. Did
Libya,
you know?
maybe?
Yes, Libya. I was going to say, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering why they didn't go to Iran.
Why they didn't go to Iran? Does Iran have fighter pilots?
When the Iraqis when we attacked Iraq, basically their entire air force took off and landed in Iran, and the Iranians did not give those planes back. I think there are a few MiGs over there. There's some old F-5s. They have quite a few old F-5s, Vietnam era F-5s. Their military, their air force is the most in need of new equipment.
It's funny you say
That's
that because I was watching this is kind of tangentially related, but I was watching a trailer for the new Top Gun movie, Top Gun 2. It's only taken, what, 30 years for the second one to come out. But right in the opening scene, you can go, audience, you can go check this out. If you go to YouTube and Google the trailer for Top Gun 2, the first thing I swore that I saw was an F-18 painted in Iranian colors that that kind of dropped down in the sky. And I'm thinking, oh, so this is a war between the US and Iran in the sky. And I was wondering, is that even where did they get the F-18s? Is that feasible or is that pure Hollywood?
I don't think that the Iranian Air Force has anything above F-5 that is American made, unless they're doing some backdoor deals with Taiwan. I don't. I'm thinking what countries that are allies have F-15s and F-18s. Possibly Poland, because they were ready to give away some of their old MiGs. I don't know. Something you said, Rachel, that I thought was very interesting when you were talking about nuclear weapons. Are we absolutely sure that Ukraine doesn't have a few nukes tucked away somewhere?
Tactical nukes? I mean,
I don't know. I wouldn't
depends
know
what
about
kind of nukes.
tactical. Possibly just something they can sling across the border. I don't know. But I always thought that Ukraine was one of those on the border countries when it came to uh, the possible possession of nuclear weapons.
Hmm. Well, when I hear the word Ukraine, I think of the Russian Ukraine, which basically means border. Literally means border. So,
Mhm,
it's kind of one of those buffer countries where you
mhm.
don't really know what is going on inside of it, and there's so much corruption and infighting and power struggles between different factions, and of course it's ripe for exploitation, which is essentially what has happened and what ultimately led to it being the host of the latest east-west confrontation. And we've seen that in other countries as well, Syria, Libya, to a lesser extent Libya, but still. And I mean, are you surprised that it's come to this? I mean, Kissinger warned against exactly doing what ended up getting us to this point, which was treating Ukraine like it was just like an outpost to deal weapons and to arm up the country in an effort to contain Russia or to maybe annoy Russia or whatever it was. And he said, look, that's just a surefire way to end up in a hot conflict. Are you surprised that we're where we are today with respect to Ukraine? Getting off a little bit of the topic of
No,
Iraq.
no. I, with all due respect to Dr. Kissinger, the Ukrainians are driving Russian tanks and flying Russian planes. I don't know what equipment we dumped on them before the invasion. It's all Russian. And so I don't understand exactly. Maybe small arms, machine guns, bazookas, javelins. It's a very, I try very hard to avoid as much as possible getting into deep conversations about Ukraine because there's so much. It's so complicated. Everything you said is exactly right. That country, the glue that kept Ukraine together was corruption. At the same time, they were training a tremendous number of computer programmers, cyber specialists, that were a lot of them just moving over to the West. And this invasion has certainly done one thing. It has united the Ukrainian people temporarily, because it's either watch my house get blown up or grab a gun. I love it. Every Ukrainian they talk to says the same thing. Tell the Russian soldiers they're going to die here.
Yeah, except for the ones in the East. It seems like they're always left out of the conversation, right? I mean, when we talk about
Yes.
Ukraine now in the West, and when we hear media reports on Ukraine, it's always Western Ukraine, or the part of Ukraine that is not ultimately controlled or dominated by Russians or Russian culture or Russian history. But in the East, we never heard about, the 8 years or 7 years of shelling that took place there. We never heard of the low level infighting that was going on that border. It seems like the world didn't much care because it was seen as a skirmish between neighbors, and we just kind of turned a blind eye, like the world turns a blind eye to all of the nonsense that's been going on in Yemen. And when I say nonsense, I mean civilian deaths going on in Yemen. And suddenly now everybody's told to care, and they put up their Ukrainian flags in their social media profiles beside their 3 doses of the vaccine icons. And now suddenly everybody's imagining that, like you say, like all of Ukraine is united. But we keep forgetting about those people in Eastern Ukraine who we never hear from.
Rachel, when the Russians 5 years ago started making noise around Donetsk in eastern Ukraine, and it was apparent from anyone who read about the situation there that the majority of people living in eastern Ukraine were ethnic Russian. It was about 40-60 when I saw it, with 60%, maybe even plus, ethnic Russian. And then 3 years ago, Crimea. Anyone who thought that this conflict was going to end with those two areas of conflict, this was coming. It was coming. The surprises that I have, the difficulties that the Russian military has had in keeping this conflict under control. I don't know if it's because all the weapons and things just being dumped on Ukraine, which is going to create quite a lot of weapons proliferation, if you ask me. But I do think it's not a surprise to me that it happened. I also don't feel. I think it's absurd to think that after this conflict is resolved, that Putin's going to invade Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia.
Poland.
I just don't see that.
Do you think that he's going to touch 1 square inch of NATO soil?
No,
ever?
I don't. And also, Poland's military is a lot more formidable, in my opinion, than the Ukraine.
I know, because
And
Macron is here in France,
mhm.
in terms of his pan-European defense that he would like. Is he has this big dream of France being a leader in a pan-European defense army kind of creation, and Poland seems to be a big feature of that. You know, they can do like purely European missions in Africa, etc. And I think without the Polish army, there wouldn't be much to the pan-European army.
I think you're right. There's not a lot of backbone to a lot of these European NATO countries. Uh, I'm curious, do you think Macron's gonna sail to re-election?
Oh, that's a whole other issue. I mean, the
I
audience
know I
may not
should have
know
brought
this,
it up,
but oh
forgive
no,
me.
I can do a brief sidebar for you. I mean, it's the election is in April, and there's two rounds. The first round, there's several candidates, and Macron isn't even. He flat out said, "I'm not debating until after the first round's over." He's that confident that he's going to make it to the second round, and polls basically bear that out. I think he just may sail to a second term, a second 5-year term, despite all of the opposition to a lot of the policies that he's introduced, and people not being thrilled with their lot right now. But one thing that people can absolutely say is he has increased buying power for the middle class more than other previous presidents. And of course that's being chipped away by all of the crises that we're seeing now that he probably could have handled differently. But it seems like it seems like it may just be a foregone conclusion.
That's what I was thinking. He's
Yeah.
really built up a lot of goodwill internationally. That is something that you don't see a lot, in my opinion, from there are some, and I haven't heard from Marine Le Pen. What's up with Marine Le Pen? Is she even gonna stand in the first election?
She could very well end up being once again the candidate to face off against Macron in the second round. The problem in France right now is that the left is non-existent because Macron basically adopted all of the French left and was able to pull them into his camp, with the exception of far left, which doesn't amount to that much, frankly. But there's so many right and far right candidates that it's their electorate is completely fractured amongst those candidates, and they're having a tough time getting behind one single candidate so that they have a shot against Macron. And I think probably going to happen is there's going to be a fight between two or three of them. Eric Zemmour, who was a former journalist, right wing, Marine Le Pen, and maybe a third one somewhere. But probably those two are going to square off for the slot against Macron in the final round. And then what's going to be really interesting here is see where in the second round of voting, where all of the voters from the other candidates, including the far left, including the smaller, less popular candidates, who they all line up behind. Do they line up behind establishment Macron, or do they line up behind anti-establishment right-winger Marine Le Pen or Eric
Mm,
Zemmour? And they're all basically the same flavor or different
sure.
flavors of the same type of candidate. Um, that's the big question. In the second round, where do the voters of all the candidates who got knocked off in the first round go? And I think that's going to decide the election. And frankly, I've added it up. Every time a poll comes out, I'm skeptical of polls because they're not completely reliable, but I assume that there is some value to them. I think, okay, where could all of these candidates, voters end up going? And I think if you add up all of the right-wing support, it could be quite close in the second round. I don't
Oh
think
my
it's,
goodness.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
fascinating, and I have
Because
never
you have the right wing that won't vote for Macron, like the far right will not vote for
sure.
him. And then you have the left anti-establishment or the purely anti-establishment candidates whose voters will not vote for Macron because he's establishment. So I think it could end up being close for that reason, unless there's something I'm not seeing. I think it would be more interesting for the pollsters to dig into the who people are, why they're currently declaring voting intentions for particular candidates, so we can really get an idea as to what's going on in their head and whether or not they could end up supporting Macron as an alternative to the guy that they're supporting now who gets knocked out in the first round. It's going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be a lot closer than people anticipate, frankly, but he could end up making it through.
I want to apologize for taking you off track, but I want to thank you because I've got to be honest, as long as I've known you, you've never been wrong with your insight into French politics. So I had to
There's always a
ask.
first.
I had to ask. Haven't
Well,
seen
Eric,
anything.
we should tell the audience that you actually have a connection to France. Why don't you tell us what that is?
I was raised in Angoulême in Charente. My family lives there. And my mother's a French national. She comes and goes, 6 months here, 6 months there. I absolutely love France. It's part of me. And I'm so jealous that you are in Paris and I'm in Central Texas.
Oh, well, hey, I mean, it's nice to change things up once in a while. I can tell you
Yeah.
that. I mean, grass is always greener, right? Especially
Yeah.
right now with our gas prices. So Texas,
I,
it's not quite that, right?
Rachel, I filled up yesterday and for 12 gallons, it was $52.
Is that good or bad? I can't even, I have lost my
That is
bearings being here.
terrible. I
Oh, it is?
remember a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, filling up for $30, and now it's 52.
Well, here it's 2 something euros per gallon, per
It's
liter,
always a
per
nightmare in
liter.
France.
It's like, I actually was asking people the other day at the pool, the lifeguards, because I'm a competitive swimmer, right? At the master's level.
Mhm.
I was asking people at the pool, why, even though it's such a sunny day and you'd expect everybody to be at the pool, why has nobody been here for the past week? And all of them agree. And I guess they talked about the same thing. They're like, I think people are limiting their travel, even locally, because the gas prices are just so astronomically high with no end in sight. And I don't think things are going to get much better for Europe anytime soon, because Europe shot itself in the face. Well, let's just say they aimed at Russia with respect to sanctions really early on in this conflict, and the gun recoiled into its face and
Mhm.
and screwed us. That's what's happened.
I'll tell you, if I take a seat outside and look in, I think that the most difficult issue for the Biden administration is going to be the price of gasoline, not Ukraine, not diplomatic relations. It's going to be inflation and the price of gasoline, mainly because his administration has been so aggressive working with the more left-leaning ecological groups and nature groups to stop any drilling domestically, and even stop drilling in Texas, for goodness sake. And that's a big deal here. And people, they see it simply, this is what I pay for gas and I can't afford it. And they don't see that, this is keeping the environment clean and allows you to take your kids to the park. They just see what they have to pay. Uh, so I don't know what's going to happen. I think you are totally on track that this is not something that's going to go away soon.
Well, first of all, we know for a fact here in Europe, I mean, after all this broke loose with Russia over Ukraine and the West imposed sanctions, and Biden ultimately said, well, we're going to stop importing Russian gas. I think that surprised a lot of Americans who could never have imagined that the US imported Russian oil. but
Yeah.
but suddenly here in Europe, it was Biden was like, well, hey, Europe doesn't need Russian gas. They can wean themselves off of that. We'll replace it. It's like, how are you going to do that? Where's the infrastructure? Like, you think you can just flip a switch and suddenly everything's going to be okay, and Europe can make policy decisions that turn on a dime. Russia, meanwhile, is like, okay, fine. You don't want our gas? We'll just reroute it to India or China or whatever. It's not like they have a shortage of customers. We are screwed here. And everybody I talk
Mhm.
to is like, that's nice that Biden is promising us, oh, well, don't worry, we'll figure it out. You're not dealing with it.
No.
And European politicians are just blindly going along with it, saying, well, I guess we'll figure it out. Maybe in a few years we'll figure it out. I mean, even the European Commission vice president said it's pretty much impossible for us to do without Russian gas in Europe. It's not even realistic. And some countries, if it's cut, are going to be completely off the rails.
Germany.
Yeah.
You know, inflation, Rachel, is also beginning to become more apparent. There are things missing off of shelves, and things are getting more expensive. I'm noticing. These are real changes that I've never actually paid attention to in the past, or maybe they just haven't gotten this bad. I was overseas or something, I don't know, but I'm actually noticing these changes. And this is a very aggressive time we're living in, for things happening and changing.
Do you notice it in Texas too? Because I always thought Texas was somewhat cushioned from whatever nonsense was going on kind of elsewhere in the world, because Texas has a lot more autonomy, or seems to have a lot more autonomy and focus on individualism, which kind of, I would assume, would translate to more independence of the state vis-a-vis even the federal government. Or is it more self-sufficient in Texas?
Well, Rachel, I'm one of these Texans that says, go Texas. So, I probably annoy a lot of people, but the truth is, it is hitting us. We export from Texas to the other states a lot of foodstuffs, wheat, rice, and livestock. And then, of course, there's the petroleum, the oil. And so much, the federal government has inserted itself so much into these processes that we aren't really doing much oil exploration, or um, we used to always be, I want to say, self-sufficient with
Mhm.
that commodity. But I don't know why the changes are happening now. And when I sit back and I have to pay half of a C note to fill up my gas tank, $50. I have never seen that before. Never. Uh, the the
Yeah.
most ever, 30.
And
And
you're in
it's,
Texas,
yeah.
which you think oil would, car fuel would just be spewing out of the ground. You're
Rachel,
floating on it.
the one thing that you see in Texas, if you're in El Paso, well, maybe not El Paso, but if you're in Amarillo to Houston to Texarkana, down San Antonio, Trump signs everywhere, new Trump signs everywhere.
New Trump
Let's
signs.
go.
Do they
Let
realize what era they're in right now? That he's not around right now. But what does that mean to you? What do
Well,
you think's going
what
on?
that means to me is that they are prepared, just like Marine Le Pen's diehard supporters. They plan on making him the candidate in 2024. And anyone that thinks he's not going to run need to think twice. I think we probably are going to have a repeat of the same candidates. Uh,
Hillary and Trump?
that's good. I was thinking Biden, but I'll take Hillary.
I mean,
I
I
would
just
rather have
automatically
Hillary, to be
assume.
honest. I would rather have Hillary. She's a very
I am
intelligent
assuming
woman.
that Biden's a one and done, but
I've heard that too.
no.
When I saw him walking, holding the guy's arm, I thought, well, maybe he's not running for re-election. I don't know.
We had
But
a
Trump,
guest
I
on
think, is.
yesterday who kept calling him crash test dummy.
Oh no. Well,
So,
I do think Trump is going to run. If you think of his personality and think of what he's been doing, raising money, I get 20 messages a day asking money for Trump, for a billionaire. But that's okay. It's all politics. I do think he's going to run again. I just don't know who the Republicans can put up that's going to motivate people and galvanize people as Donald Trump does. You know,
yeah, well, I mean, he had a rough time with the intelligence community. Were you surprised, for example, when um, Joe Biden was, for example, his son Hunter Biden came out um, during the Trump administration, run up to Trump's reelection, which he lost, obviously, that Hunter Biden had a laptop that was found and Hunter Biden has been involved. He's kind of like the Forrest Gump of foreign policy, despite not really having much foreign policy knowledge. Apparently, he ended up on a board of a big energy company in Ukraine that was under investigation for corruption in the wake of the attempt to overthrow the non-aligned Ukraine government and to basically throw him. Well, I mean, they successfully ran him out of town, right? So,
Mhm.
I mean, but then suddenly Hunter Biden moves into to the board of a big company. His laptop miraculously appears, and there's all sorts of supposition. It came out in the New York Post as to what was on that laptop, and then suddenly you end up with 50 members of the U.S. intelligence community, heavy hitters, saying this is garbage, it's Russian disinformation, and now we know for a fact, as of a few days ago, that it's totally true. So, I mean, what is the deal with these big heavy hitters in the intelligence community and the politicization of way that they're behaving?
Rachel, when I looked at that list of 50 and I separated anybody that was CIA connected, it wasn't very many. It was members of the intelligence community from a wide group of organizations. The CIA affiliated persons on that list were very high-ranking CIA officials, and they were officials that had already made a name for themselves of being very politically involved. And they were appointed by Obama and some by Biden, and they were political appointments. Take, for instance, Leon Panetta. He was appointed director of the CIA. Leon Panetta is a financial man. He knows nothing about intelligence, but he was appointed director of the CIA. And that's the smart thing that I think the Democrats did when Obama was president, and Biden has done the same thing. They are putting political appointees into positions that have in the past been reserved for lifelong persons in those organizations that have moved their way up. Certainly, two of the CIA persons on that list they were aggressive in trying to get Trump impeached. I know the ground level, the operations officers, the analysts, the people working in DS&T and in the new cyber directorate, they are still conservative. It's still a conservative organization at the root. There's still a lot of Latter-day Saints. I get
Of
asked that
course,
a
and they're
lot,
very
and
good at recruiting, I understand.
yes, it's wonderful. I'm interested to see if we do get a Republican in office, what they're going to do to try and make these organizations not so political anymore. When I was working, I had a rule. I don't ask questions. The administration sets the agenda, and I have to trust them because they were elected to give me my orders and follow them. And that's what I did. I worked under Obama, I worked under Clinton, and I worked under George Bush. Uh, so, I mean, it was from one day to the next a different story, but I did what I was supposed to do.
Did you feel that there was an attempt to politicize intelligence while you're working for the agency? Did you ever feel any kind of pressure in that regard?
Not with what I was doing, but I had decided early on I was never going to be a manager level. I wasn't going to be a chief of station. I wasn't going to be a group chief. I wanted to be overseas collecting intelligence. I knew that that was what I was good at and what I was hired for. I did not see myself as a manager. And so I certainly did not question George W. Bush. I get asked this question, well, not George W., the second Bush. Certainly
Yeah,
never.
George W. Yeah.
Oh, was George W.? Okay.
The first one was George H.W.
Yes,
Pretty
and then
close.
Barbara in there somewhere.
Right.
You know, I did not question anything because 9/11 was a visceral event for me. It is still the
Mhm.
event of my life. It separates my life
Mhm.
before and after. And I was heavily involved with the counterterrorism issue immediately following that event. And so I was happy to go in and work so that we could create a military footprint in Iraq and then move into Afghanistan. I had no qualms about the fact that we weren't really in Iraq to find weapons of mass destruction. I knew what we were there for. We were there to lay the groundwork for a footprint, a platform to launch our military into Afghanistan. We needed that to get into Afghanistan and drag those people out that were responsible for what happened on that day. Um, in hindsight, I'm an old man now. I do see some things different, but then that is how I felt. I didn't question, a lot of my conservative friends get very angry with me when I say that Hillary Clinton's involvement in Benghazi was really basically non existent and that they're just trying to find a way to hurt her. They were just
Mhm.
trying to hurt Hillary. But I'm going to be honest about things. I just am. It's the way it is. And when Barack Obama was president, I had no problems doing my job.
Were you surprised in the wake of the 9/11 attacks that were essentially perpetrated by majority of Saudis? Were you surprised that Saudi Arabia was untouched and remains untouched?
Oh my gosh, Rachel, you and I could do 5 hours consecutive on Saudi Arabia.
Sure.
Uh, I know I know what the dichotomy is inside of the kingdom. And you have Wahhabis that at times are against the royal family. You've got modernists at times against the royal family. Things going on inside of the kingdom are not as smooth and simple as a lot of people think. Uh, and it was a huge embarrassment to that to the royal family that most of these people were Saudi nationals.
Mhm.
I don't think the royal family was involved. It is possible that some of the princes, I mean, there are what, 2,000 of them in
Yeah, I
the
think
Al
the
Saud
report found that
family.
there was some involvement with the Saudi embassy or consulate in the US. I know that there was a report that recently came out just a few months ago clarifying the Saudi rule. And there seems to be a declassification occurring. And I think I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was a link between somebody working at the Saudi embassy and the hijackers.
That really doesn't surprise me. There are princes in the royal family that are very interested in changing that government and making it more aligned to Wahhabi Islam, and there are other princes that are looking in a different direction. What I am very, very surprised at what is happening in Yemen. I've worked in Yemen. I was in Yemen before so much was done to destroy those old cities.
Mhm.
And Saudi Arabia has a huge military with lots of modern tanks, and there's where you're going to see your F-15s. Why is it they haven't settled that issue? They have the military to do it. I just don't know why it hasn't happened. Are they maybe they're being scared if they come too hard and internationally it's going to make them look bad? I don't know.
It seems like it's just a war of attrition between Saudi
Absolutely.
Arabia and Iran-backed
Hmm.
Houthis. So it's a way for them to go at each other without frontally doing so and using Yemen as a tabletop, essentially. Kind of like
You,
Ukraine is the tabletop for a conflict between NATO and Russia,
yeah. Well,
to
you'll
put it
find this interesting,
crassly.
Rachel. You'll find this interesting. When I was in Iraq, there was a real effort by the Department of Defense to try and get the Saudi military as involved as possible with any combat, any movement. But the Saudis had all these expensive weapons and tanks and everything you could use, but they did not have a manpower that was really willing to get directly involved. The issue was troops that really never expected to be fighting in a war. And that is an issue with the Saudi military. It's always been that way. You can buy the most expensive weapon, modern ship, whatever, and if you don't have someone who is really wanting to fight, it doesn't matter.
And I understand too that the Saudis are using mercenaries a lot.
That absolutely does not surprise
UAE
me.
trained mercenaries.
I knew that they had been working with some South African mercenaries, but
Mhm.
UAE, I may have seen that as well. Uh, I have a very particular relationship in my past with I've worked with the UAE before with
Mhm.
their intel element, um, and that's something you and I can talk about offline. Um,
Mhm.
but the UAE is just an amazing place. It's really incredible, uh, and you will see a lot of foreigners there. But I was surprised to hear that they were training mercenaries in the UAE, but they are.
Yeah, and there was also the former founder of Blackwater that was involved in going over there and who lived there for a few years and who helped them put some of these things together using his wonderful skills obtained as a Navy SEAL and then later as a contractor for the United States government in Iraq.
I fortunately never had to work with Blackwater. By
Mm.
the time that I was really getting into the war zones, we had created our own security element that did that job, and it was called GRS, Global Response something. And they did the same job. They were to escort officers to meetings, make sure they were safe, and go scout
Mhm.
out places in advance. And so I never had the honor of working with Eric Prince. Is that his name?
Yep.
Yeah,
And
his
he's
group.
there have been a few iterations of Eric Prince's activity since I think some involvement in Ukraine, some involvement in
Ah,
Libya, and there's a lot of he seems to be the Where's Waldo of international intrigue. So there's a lot going on that front too. Apparently in Venezuela, negotiating with Maduro during the Trump administration. There are all sorts of weird rumors, which were picked up by The Intercept and the New York Times and the Washington Post, and it's all kind of a big mystery. Not much is confirmed beyond sources that they were in contact with that they don't reveal in their reporting. It's all very interesting, but he seems to kind of have his fingers in every pot, or fingers in every pie, I guess. Um, and I'm not sure if we've seen the end of of that story either. That's kind of an
no,
interesting sidebar, the role of mercenaries and covert, uh, um, uh, let's just say like non-state actors.
well, whenever I talk to you, I discover about 15 or 20 different side notes that you and I could go on and
Yeah,
talk
I
for
know.
another few
That's
hours.
yeah, I
Um,
know.
there, I have to tell you, I have been contacted by numerous organizations that are
Mhm.
working to get people in and out of Ukraine. And
Yeah.
they're asking me to come and get back into the game. Uh, I might I might make that decision, but not right now. I just have to get the right I want the job that's gonna leave me in Washington. I don't wanna go to Ukraine.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I go to
At some
Paris,
point, enough's enough.
yes, absolutely.
Eric Burkhart, it has been such a pleasure having you back. I have to tell the audience in the first iteration of this show, which I had unfortunately to put into a somewhat of a dormant state for about 6 years as a result of just being too busy with other things. You are one of my favorite regular guests during that first long season that lasted for 2, 3 years, I think it was.
Thank you.
And in this period of uncertainty and conflict and chaos, when I decided, hey, it's a good a time as any to rev the thing back up and to see what we can do with it. Speaking of this show, I'm so honored to have you back on and trying to help us make
I am
sense of
honored
everything
to
that's going
be
on.
I am honored to be here with you. I have to tell you, you don't have to case officer me if I'm talking to you. I'm just going to talk. I feel very
Hey,
comfortable
that's
just talking about everything.
well, it's like good old times. And I know our audience appreciates that. Thank you so much,
Well,
Eric Burkhart, former
have me back when you
CIA
can.
operations officer. And let's just tell people that they can buy your book, Mukhabarat Baby. What's the subtitle again? I know it's a long one.
That's just Mukhabarat Baby is where you would
Yeah,
find it, or my
yeah,
name on Amazon,
yeah.
and it is in Barnes and Noble and a few other places still. But
Oh,
thank you,
still. That's
and have
great
me back
because
soon, please.
oh yeah, no, with pleasure, of course,
Okay,
and you're always welcome. You're always welcome back, and it'll be a pleasure to have you back again, of course. Eric
thank you so much.
Burkhart, thank you so much.
God bless. Talk to you soon.
Um, you bet. All righty. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to let you are listening to, in case you just joined us recently, Unredacted with Rachel Marsden. You can check out all of the links related to the show. You can also find out on which platforms the show airs by going to my website at rachelmarsden.com and clicking at the top of the page. There should be a link there that tells you click here for viewing platforms for the show. You can also, while you're there, check out some of my recent writing for various publications on all of the issues of the day related to international affairs and politics. And also to let you know that this show will be back on Thursday, same time, same place, wherever you happen to be watching from now. And we are going to have an Israeli diplomat, high ranking Israeli diplomat on the show to talk about the propositions that were made by Israel to the Ukrainian president to help resolve this conflict and the kind of reaction that they got when they proposed to help mediate. And also we're going to hear from him about some of the challenges that Israel is facing diplomatically in this new world order. Not my words, not conspiratorial. Joe Biden himself said we're heading into a new world order. So I guess it's official. It's no longer a deep-seated conspiracy theory. So we'll be back on Thursday with that. This show airs Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. And next week we're going to get back into the COVID pandemic issues and everything related to that. Because while we all have our eyes on the ball in Ukraine, there's other things happening, of course. So thank you so much for joining me. I love having you with us. Remember, you can comment anytime throughout any of these shows live. And if you have any questions for our guests, I will throw them up on the screen and we can get our guests to answer them directly. So please never be shy about doing that. I'm always happy to take your questions. Thank you for all your comments. Thank you so much for tuning in. Love having you with us and hope to see you again on Thursday. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you happen to be. And catch you next time.